Has anyone ever accused you of being too emotional just to dismiss your pain?
You ever get so used to paying for something that everyone else just assumes you will keep doing it forever, like it is your assigned chore on the family roster you never agreed to? Because that is exactly how it started with me, a simple "I'll cover it this year." It's my treat, said at the end of a long week when I had a new promotion and fresh energy and thought generosity would feel like joy. And for a minute it did, because treating the people you love can feel like proof that you finally crawled out of the hole and made it, until the thank yous get shorter, the asking gets bolder, and the "my treat" slowly mutates into "your responsibility," stamped on my forehead without anyone having the decency to say it out loud. The first couple of trips were manageable because I could swing the flights with reward points and the rental with a corporate discount that made me feel like a wizard, and when my sister joked that I was our travel fairy and my mother said it was good for you to share your blessings, I laughed along, telling myself it was a kind of family tax you pay when you do better than you thought you would, except taxes have rules and caps and receipts, while this thing had no ceiling and no bottom and definitely no gratitude policy. It became a rhythm that looked harmless from the outside and felt rotten on the inside, since I was the one comparing prices, fronting deposits, juggling cancellation windows, and smiling through all the little comments that carry more weight than anyone wants to admit, like my brother saying, "You picked the nicer place, you've got taste," which sounds flattering until you hear the translation, because "you've got taste" was always paired with "you've got the card," and when the group text would light up with requests for upgrades or extra nights or an add-on the size of a mortgage payment, I would push back a little and get the same chorus of jokes about how I was organized and efficient, and the adult in the room. While the adult in the room was calculating whether this latest generous move meant skipping my own dentist appointment for another month. I tried to draw soft lines that felt firm to me and invisible to them, telling everyone we should split the grocery bill this time since I already covered the flights and the house, and they nodded and said, "Of course, absolutely, totally fair." Then stood around the kitchen while I swiped my card for a cart that could have fed a small camp, and when I brought it up later, they laughed it off as a mix-up, which is the kind of phrase people use when their mistake was actually pretty convenient. By the time the next trip rolled around, the family language had changed in ways I only noticed because I was paying attention, with sentences that started with "when you book" instead of "should we book," and suggestions that assumed the deluxe option was a given because we only do this once a year, which sounds reasonable until you realize we meant me. And the once-a-year part had quietly become twice, and sometimes 3 times when birthdays or anniversaries got wrapped into the same rolling expectation, and I caught myself saying yes before anyone finished a sentence, because saying no would require a speech, and I was tired of speeches that made me the complicated one. The resentment did not arrive as a thunderclap. It leaked in like a slow drip you ignore until the wall warps, and even then you stand there with a towel pretending it is manageable, still trying to be the good daughter and the cool sister who does not make money a thing. Because in our family money was always a thing and somehow also never allowed to be discussed directly, which is a neat trick if you think about it, since it kept me paying while everyone else kept their hands clean. So I started doing something small that felt, to me, like slipping a pebble into my own pocket just to remember I still had weight in the room, and that meant I booked this year's place entirely in my name instead of attaching their profiles. And I made sure every single piece was refundable without penalty up to the last week, and I told nobody, telling myself I was just protecting my points and my flexibility while another part of me admitted I was also testing something. Because if you want to know who expects what from you, stop announcing your steps and see who panics. The test came sooner than I expected when my sister texted a link to a pre-arrival experience package that cost more than my first car and wrote that she had already told the kids we were doing it. And my mother chimed in with a cheerful message about how it would be memories for a lifetime, and my brother followed with a laughing line about how I should book before the price goes up. Which is the kind of comment that makes people outside a family roll their eyes and people inside a family swallow hard because you hear what is really being said. So I replied with a long, polite message about budgets and balance and how we might skip it this time. Then I set my phone down and counted to 20 while the chat went silent. After which my sister wrote that it was disappointing but she understood, and I stared at that word until it lost its shape and decided that if they understood, then they could also understand paying a deposit themselves for once. That night I logged into the add-on portal, removed my saved card from the profile, watched the countdown on the hold I had placed earlier for a smaller activity I did not actually want, let it expire without a sound, and went to bed with the first easy breath I had taken in months, because in the morning the group text was a flurry of confusion about how the hold had lapsed and whether I could just fix it like you always do. And I typed a careful message saying I was tied up at work and they should go ahead if it mattered that much, which is exactly what they did, using my brother's card for the deposit while I sat through a meeting feeling a private, guilty, petty relief that tasted like the beginning of a boundary. And I would love to tell you that tiny shift solved anything, but really it just cracked the surface, because a few days later I was going to see words about myself that would turn that small experiment into a plan. What I began to notice, slowly at first and then all at once, was that the small jokes and comments, which I had once brushed aside as harmless quirks of family banter, were actually markers of a deeper truth, and while on the surface they sounded playful, underneath they carried a tone that revealed how little respect was left for the fact that I was the one financing nearly every step of these vacations. My brother had this habit of clapping me on the shoulder whenever a bill appeared at a restaurant and saying something like, "She's got this one," in front of everyone, and though I tried to laugh, the room would go quiet for a beat before people moved on as if nothing unusual had been said, but inside I felt like I had been pushed against the wall and labeled, not as a sister or a daughter, but as the person expected to swipe the card without hesitation. There were moments when I would attempt to voice my discomfort, sometimes joking that I might need to start a savings account just for family trips or that maybe someone else could take a turn this year, and the reactions were always the same: laughter, light teasing, or some remark from my mother reminding me that I was the one in the best position, and it would be silly to nickel and dime when we were making memories. That kind of response shut me down quickly because the guilt slid in like a blade, and even though I wanted to shout that my position did not erase the fact that I had my own bills, retirement, and emergencies to consider, I kept quiet because no one in the room seemed interested in acknowledging my sacrifices beyond a brief, almost robotic thank you that felt as if it was delivered out of obligation rather than genuine appreciation. The worst part was that over time I stopped being invited into the actual planning conversations, as though my role had shifted from participant to sponsor, so while they were exchanging links to resorts or discussing possible destinations, I was often left out until the final choice was made and a message would arrive in the group chat along the lines of, "She'll handle the booking, she knows how to get the best deal." I remember sitting there staring at the screen, realizing that I had been reduced to a function, a sort of travel agent crossed with a bank teller. And the sharpness of that realization made me wonder how long it had been since they last viewed me as just another family member excited about a holiday together. I tried subtle forms of resistance, like suggesting we do something more low-key or asking if we could set a firm budget so no one was overwhelmed, but those attempts never stuck because they were met with offhand dismissal, such as my sister saying that vacations were the one place we should not have to think about money, or my father joking that if he had my job he would never even look at price tags, which was supposed to be funny, but landed more like a verdict that I had no right to push back because I was, in their eyes, endlessly capable of footing the bill. Each of these interactions chipped away at me until what used to feel like generosity now felt like entrapment. And I began to sense that every trip was becoming less about shared memories and more about what they could extract while keeping their own wallets safely tucked away. The atmosphere during these discussions shifted too, because instead of asking me what I thought about certain activities or excursions, they simply announced plans as though they had already been decided, with phrases like, "when we go," or "when you book." Phrases that sounded ordinary until I noticed the pronoun choice and realized how they had woven my role into the very grammar of their sentences. It was as if they were saying out loud, without any embarrassment, that the act of booking and paying was mine alone, while their responsibility was to show up, enjoy themselves, and occasionally comment on how wonderful everything was, as though praise were the currency I should be satisfied with. I could feel a kind of bitterness taking root inside me, a bitterness that I fought against because no one wants to become the resentful relative who kills the mood, but it was growing harder to hide, especially when the bills started stacking up in my own life. Repairs to my house, medical costs, and the quiet reality of wanting to save for my own future, all of which I had to manage alone, while simultaneously carrying the weight of these so-called shared experiences that never truly felt shared in the financial sense. There was a particularly raw moment when I had to postpone a personal project I had been dreaming about for years, a project that required only a fraction of what I had spent on the last holiday, and as I sat looking at the canceled invoice, I thought to myself that my family would never even know what I had given up, because they had stopped imagining that my life outside their vacations might require sacrifices too. Still, even with all of this frustration building inside me, I had not yet reached the breaking point, because the truth is you can rationalize a lot when it comes to family. And I kept telling myself that it was better to swallow my pride than to start a fight that might leave scars we could never heal. But I was getting tired of being laughed off, tired of being typecast, tired of pretending that this lopsided arrangement was sustainable or even fair. And yet, despite all of that fatigue, I kept going along because I thought the worst thing that could happen was more of the same. But the real truth, the thing I had no idea was coming, was that the worst thing had not even happened yet, and when it did, it would land like a punch to the stomach that I could never ignore again. It happened on a night when I was not even thinking about family trips, because my mind was on work deadlines and an exhausting week that had drained every ounce of energy. Yet one small slip of circumstance changed everything I thought I knew about my role in our family. My sister had left her phone on the counter while she was in the other room, and I was simply grabbing a glass of water when a notification lit up the screen, displaying a preview of a message in a group chat that I had never seen before. And although I knew I should look away, some instinct told me this was something I needed to know, so I glanced at the thread, and in that single second my stomach dropped because I saw my own name next to a comment calling me the family ATM. I wish I could say it was just one person, maybe a cousin trying to be funny, something that could be brushed off as an isolated comment, but the truth is the more I scrolled, the clearer it became that this was not a slip of the tongue or a joke taken out of context. It was a whole conversation that had gone on for weeks, maybe months, where they casually referred to me as if I were not their daughter or sister, but some kind of funding mechanism that existed solely to make their vacations possible. My brother had typed something about not stressing over costs since she'll cover it, followed by a string of laughing reactions, and my mother, the same woman who had raised me to value hard work and responsibility, had chimed in with a message about how, at least she gets to feel useful this way, which stung in a way I cannot even describe because it was not just dismissive, it was demeaning, like my worth had been reduced to the size of my bank account. I stood there reading message after message, and each one seemed to slice deeper, because there were comments about how I always caved in whenever anyone pushed, about how I was too proud to admit she hates paying, and even a joke from my sister that if the family ever needed a new car they should just call me, because I would probably cover it as long as it was dressed up as a memory-making event. The cruelty was not in the individual words so much as in the ease with which they spoke them, the way their sentences carried no hesitation, no awareness that they might be crossing a line, as though I had never been a person with feelings, only a function, a resource, a convenient way to keep the family rolling forward without anyone else breaking a sweat. I wanted to storm into the room right then, confront my sister, shove the phone in her hands, and demand to know how she could sit across from me at dinner, smile in my face, and still participate in something so degrading. But I froze because my body was stuck between anger and humiliation, and all I could think was that maybe this was how they had all been talking about me for years, and I had been too blind, too eager to believe I was loved, to notice it. I replayed every moment of hesitation I had ever shown about paying, every joke I had laughed at too quickly, every little boundary I had failed to enforce, and in that replay I heard their words echoing, confirming what deep down I had always feared. They did not see me as generous, they saw me as weak. For a long time that night I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my own phone, scrolling through old texts where I had arranged flights, booked rentals, or sent screenshots of confirmation emails. And I realized that I had been documenting my own role as the appointed financier, as though I had been building a case against myself without knowing it. And while part of me wanted to cut them off immediately, to fire back with the same sharpness they had shown me, another part of me, the quieter, more calculating side, told me that an explosion would only give them the chance to play innocent, to pretend it was all a misunderstanding, or worse, to paint me as dramatic and ungrateful. So instead I sat there and began to think in a way I had never thought before, not about how to endure, but about how to end it. The decision that formed in my mind was not one I made lightly, because years of being the dependable one had wired me to solve problems quietly, to keep the peace, but after seeing those words, I knew peace was already gone. And the only thing left was to take control of the one power I still had: money. I opened my laptop, pulled up the booking system, and stared at the reservations for flights, hotel, and the rental house, all neatly confirmed and fully paid with my card, and I hovered over the cancellation button with my heart racing in my chest, thinking about how one click could undo all of it. At first, I could not bring myself to do it, because there was still that echo of obligation in my head, the voice that said, "But they're your family." Yet the louder voice, the one that had been silenced for too long, was screaming that family does not label you an ATM and laugh behind your back. When I finally pressed cancel on the first booking, I expected to feel guilty, maybe even panicked, but instead what washed over me was a strange calm, the kind of calm you feel when you realize you are no longer going to beg for fairness. You are going to enforce it. I canceled the hotel next, then the rental car, then the excursions, one by one until the screen showed me nothing but confirmation emails of reverse charges and credits flowing back to my account. And with each click I felt like I was reclaiming pieces of myself they had chipped away for years. That night I slept better than I had in months, though I woke up knowing that this was only the first step, because the real confrontation was still ahead, and I would have to decide whether to tell them in advance or let them discover it the hard way. But for the first time, I no longer felt like the powerless one sitting outside of a private chat. I felt like the one with the upper hand, and the thought that my family, so confident in their assumptions, so comfortable in their entitlement, had no idea what was already set in motion gave me a kind of strength I had not felt in years, and that strength whispered a single truth: the ATM was officially closed. Once the shock cooled into something steadier and harder, I realized that what I needed was not a tearful confrontation or a dramatic speech that would be picked apart and mocked in that same smug thread, but a plan that lived in the quiet places where I had always done the actual work, because if I had been the one to book every flight, hold every reservation, and front every deposit, then I also held the keys to undoing it. And I could do it without a meeting, without a vote, and without begging anyone to understand why this time was different. I opened a fresh folder on my laptop and started saving everything like a meticulous auditor who has decided to stop cleaning up everyone else's messes, taking screenshots of refund confirmations, forwarding credit notices to a separate address I use for financial records, and labeling each file with dates and reference numbers so that when the questions started flying I would not just have feelings, I would have proof, and that thought alone steadied my breathing in a way no amount of venting ever had. While I was quietly disassembling the trip they had built on my back, the group chat kept pulsing with excitement, and there was something so telling about the ease with which they requested one more upgrade or tossed around ideas for add-ons that cost more than some people's monthly rent, as if money were confetti that fell from a ceiling whenever they felt festive, which was rich coming from people who had never once offered to split anything beyond a comedy bag of snacks for the drive, and even then they somehow forgot their wallets. Amanda sent a link to a guided experience that looked exactly like the kind of thing they would all insist on doing if someone else paid. Josh joked about needing the bigger car because he had accidentally promised to bring extra gear. And my mother asked me to check whether our rental had early check-in because she did not want to sit around and wait, all of which read like a script they had performed so many times they could do it in their sleep. And I realized that my absence from planning had not been an oversight, it had been the point, because if I was not in the room where decisions were made, I could not say no. I answered in measured tones that looked polite and sounded cooperative, because there was no value in tipping my hand early, and every time I typed a line about looking into it or checking my schedule. I was also toggling another tab to cancel something they were counting on, fully refundable and fully within my right because my card, my account, and my name had built the entire structure they were now walking through with their shoes on. And there was something almost cleansing about watching it come down piece by piece without a single raised voice, no drama, just the simple math of boundaries arriving late, but arriving strong. I moved my own plans off the board as well, not because I was backing down from travel, but because I wanted the freedom to take my own break on my own terms, so I booked a small, private getaway for myself with money I had just reclaimed. Nothing flashy and nothing I needed to brag about, because this was not a competition, it was a correction, and for once I wanted to spend time without paying for anyone else's good mood. The only thing left was timing, which mattered more than it seemed, because a move like this would either land as a tantrum or as a boundary depending on when it arrived, and I wanted it to land with the clarity of a bell, not the noise of an argument. So I waited until everything was fully reversed and the refunds had posted. Then I double-checked each confirmation and put the screenshots in a single image with the booking numbers visible, a simple collage that could tell a story without a single extra word from me. I thought about adding a paragraph explaining how I felt and why I was done, but I deleted it because they had already written their own explanation in that chat when they labeled me the family ATM, and nothing I could say would be as honest as their own words. So I typed one line that carried all the weight I had been lifting for years and none of the apology they expected from me. In the seconds before I sent it, my hands shook the way they do when you step away from a habit you have carried like a second skin, and I remembered every time I had covered a shortfall without shaming anyone. Every time I had picked the nicer option because I wanted us to feel good together, every time I had told myself that family comes first even when it meant I came last. And I felt a kind of grief for the version of me who thought that being generous would eventually be enough to teach them how to be generous back. Then the grief burned off, leaving focus, and I dropped the image into the chat with the single sentence I had decided was the only thing I owed them. The ATM is closed. All payments canceled. Handle your own plans. I hit send and watched the message slide into the thread and sit there, solid and undeniable, like a locked door that no one had seen coming, and as the typing bubbles began to pop up in frantic clusters, I let the phone vibrate on the table without reaching for it, because the point of this was not to argue or plead, the point was to end the performance, and I was ready to bring down the curtain. When I finally pressed send and watched that screenshot settle into the group chat, showing every canceled booking lined up with reference numbers and refund confirmations, I felt something I had not expected. Because instead of panic or guilt or even the urge to grab my phone back and unsend the message, what washed over me was a heavy, steady calm, the kind of calm that comes when you realize there is nothing left to explain and nothing left to negotiate, because the truth is already out in the open and the reaction of others is no longer yours to manage. The typing bubbles appeared almost instantly, flashing and disappearing, then flashing again, which told me that they were stumbling over each other to respond, probably debating whether to come at me with guilt, anger, or mock shock. But before the first full message appeared, I powered the phone down and set it face down on the table, because I had no interest in hearing them scramble for a defense they had already shredded with their own words. The silence that followed was not the silence of nothing happening, because I knew on the other side of that dark screen the family thread was probably on fire with accusations, with half-hearted excuses, with attempts to paint me as the unreasonable one. But it was a silence I had chosen for myself, and that distinction mattered more than anything, since for years I had lived in the noise of constant demands, subtle pressure, and casual entitlement, yet in that moment I finally learned how to choose peace, not by asking them for it, but by enforcing it myself. I poured myself a drink and sat in the quiet of my own home, realizing how foreign it felt to be the one who ended the cycle instead of fueling it, and as strange as it sounds, I actually smiled. Because for once the money in my account was staying there for me, and for once the weight of making everyone else happy had been set down where it belonged on their own shoulders. The hours that followed stretched in a way that was almost surreal, because I kept expecting some knock on the door or some furious phone call that would demand immediate resolution, yet nothing came except the occasional buzz of my phone against the wood, muted by the fact that I refused to flip it back on, and I thought about how many times I had interrupted my own life to answer their texts, to fix their problems, to book one more upgrade so they could live a little larger without ever once acknowledging what it cost me, and I realized that ignoring them now was not cruelty, it was balance, the long-delayed moment where my boundaries finally mattered more than their convenience. The next morning, when the sun came up and I still had not turned my phone on, I made coffee and thought about what they must be doing, whether they had scrambled to rebook with their own cards, whether they had argued among themselves about who should cover what now that I was out, whether they had cursed me behind my back or sat stunned in silence, because the foundation they had relied on had been yanked away in one stroke. I will never know the exact sequence of their reactions, because I never went back into that thread, never scrolled through the storm I had unleashed, and that mystery is part of the power, because the truth is I did not need to hear their excuses or their anger. I only needed them to feel the absence of my automatic compliance, to understand in the most undeniable way that the machine they had labeled an ATM was run by a human being who had finally unplugged it. As the days passed, some calls came through from numbers I recognized but did not answer, and I imagine the voicemails contained some combination of guilt-tripping and pleading, but I left them unheard. Because I wanted to protect that calm that had cost me so many years to earn, and it struck me how quickly peace can be achieved when you stop giving people access to your buttons, when you stop explaining yourself to those who have no interest in listening, and when you start believing that silence is not weakness, but strategy. I took the refunded money, booked a small trip for myself that had nothing to do with family obligations, and as I sat in that quiet space with no one demanding a bigger car or a fancier dinner, I thought about how strange it was that reclaiming something so basic, my own right to decide how my money was used, felt like freedom on a scale I had not experienced in years. What lingers with me is not regret or doubt, but a steady satisfaction that I finally played my move without theatrics, because the beauty of it was not in humiliating them. It was in withdrawing my cooperation so completely that they had no script prepared, no way to spin it, no soft landing to cushion the reality that they would now have to pay their own way. And while I know there are people who might say that family should always stick together, that maybe I went too far by canceling everything instead of just refusing to pay in the future, I would answer that family should also mean respect. That family should not mock you in private or reduce you to a wallet with legs, and if it takes a single brutal move to remind them of that truth, then so be it. So here I am, months later, still not having spoken to them about it, still holding the line I drew, still feeling that strange mix of grief and relief that comes when you finally recognize that love without respect is not love worth keeping. And though part of me sometimes wonders whether they will ever apologize or change, the larger part of me knows that the point was never their apology, the point was my freedom. And as I say this out loud, the simplest conclusion comes to mind. I am no longer the family ATM, I am simply myself again, and that is worth more than any vacation we ever took together.